First one here, we have hands versus fingers. He opens up nicely. He says, back to our original topic, reductionism, which, in case you've forgotten, is part of a sequence on the mind projection fallacy. There can be emotional problems in accepting reductionism if you think that things have to be fundamental to be fun, but this position commits us to never taking joy in anything more complicated than a quirk, and so I prefer to reject it.
Yes.
As I read that, I try to read things I like uncharitably, and so I could see someone saying, oh, well, he just doesn't like the conclusion, so he's rejecting it. But he's not engaging in wishful thinking there. I think he's describing the observed behavior in both himself and others that, you know, people who properly understand reductionism also have fun.
Yeah, I think he's talking about the idea that that can't be fun rather than that isn't true as a thing that he rejects.
Totally. Yeah. And I like this nice one-sentence summary of reductionism that's just a smidge too long to put on a mug or a bumper sticker.
It's really good summary, though.
Yeah. The reductionist thesis is that we use multi-level models for computational reasons, but physical reality has only a single level.
I wish I could memorize that, because I probably can't. It's like Jennifer's definition of rationalism, which now I have forgotten, and I need to go back and listen to that episode again, because it was short and very good, but just long enough to not fit on a bumper sticker, and so it did not stick in my brain.
I think her definition was of rationalist and rat fic, which was similar, people who employed the methods of rationality.
Okay.
More or less.
Yeah, it was definitely more of applying systemizing vibes to the world, I think, something along those lines.
Yeah, it wasn't circular, and it didn't use rationality, I think, in the definition, but yeah. So let's take this multi-level model and take a specific case of the idea that I have a hand. I'm looking at it. Well, I have two, fortunately, but I'm looking at my left one, and I notice that after looking for a second, it's composed of a palm, a thumb, and 4 fingers.
Not only that, I think that a recent discovery has been made by scientists, which is quite stunning. He says it's not your hand that holds the cup. It's actually your fingers, thumb, and palm. After scientists measured the forces exerted on the cup by each of your fingers, your thumb, and your palm, they found there was no force left over. So the force exerted by your hand must be 0.
QED. The theme here is that we can see how, not just that, a higher level reduces to a lower one. Once you can see how that's the case, they won't seem like separate things within your map. You'll be able to see how silly it is to think that your fingers could be in one place and your hand could be somewhere else.
Yeah.
And he takes a lot of digs at philosophers here.
It seems the point of this post, and I really like the post for this, is to really point out, really get to anyone who reads it on a deep, intuitive, well, duh level, how silly it is to think that your fingers could be like in one place and then your hands is somewhere else, and that it's silly to argue about whether your hand is picking up the cup or your fingers. Just because your hand reduces to fingers and palm does not mean that your hand doesn't exist. Like, it's a conceptual distinction, not a literal two different things distinction.
Yeah, and I like this post not just because it illustrates that well, but this is a good just jumping off point to illustrate what we mean by multi-level models for computational reasons.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, we don't talk about our fingers and palm and thumb when that's so many syllables when we could just use the word hand.
Yeah, exactly.
And the hand kind of means the aggregate of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, to dig into more things that these imaginary philosophers would argue about, you know, if I lose my pinky, do I still have a hand? You know, is a hand only something with a palm, thumb, and 4 fingers? What if it's got 3 fingers? It seems like you only need a sufficient amount of meat and tendons there to count as a hand.
But on the other hand, I had someone argue this I get it.
Gotcha.
When he met someone who had lost all his fingers due to frostbite, he was like, at that point, you basically don't have hands, because a hand without any fingers is just kind of a wobbly extension of your arm. And he's right. Like, you need fingers as well to really make a hand a useful hand in any meaningful way.
Yeah, hand is the word that we use for the thing at the end of our arms that we can use to manipulate stuff.
Right.
And, you know, it's often made of a thumb and 4 fingers in the palm, but my uncle has a hook that functions as his right hand. It's not a pirate's hook, unfortunately. It's the kind that he flexes his arm to like expand the rubber bands that pull it shut. So you can pick up basic things with it. I met a guy at a car dealership once who had one that he could pop on that was a full hand with digits that he could move with his mind.
Oh, nice.
And this was like 15 years ago, maybe 10. I'm really curious where this technology is at now.
How did your uncle lose his hand?
If I remember correctly, he was working on a train and the brake slipped.
Oh, jeez.
And the way that he tells it is that he stayed awake long enough to tell the paramedics, just cut it off. But, you know, who knows how much exaggeration was put in there. But given as told, it was a very badass story.
What would have the alternative been to cutting it off?
Trying to fix it.
Okay.
Oh yeah, so the as far as I understand, to get a bit more gruesome, the break didn't slip and neatly cut his arm off. It slipped in such a way that it was creeping up his arm, from fingers working
Oh.
up. Yeah.
Oh
So
shit.
yeah, he's like, rather than try and sew it all together, just chop it.
Well, so I love this next thing that I pulled out. He says, imagine philosophers suggesting that hands don't really exist, or philosophers who suggest appendigeal bridging laws to explain how a particular configuration of fingers evokes a hand into existence. And again, this is silly, but I think it is a good thing to pump our intuitions, because to me, this sounds very much like the free will debate. Philosophers actually will sometimes suggest that free will doesn't really exist, or that there's bridging laws to explain how things can evoke free will into existence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm not sure what the poll, if you polled the philosophical community, what the numbers would be, but I think it's the majority that say, yeah, free will is not a real thing as traditionally conceptualized.
I think the as traditionally conceptualized thing is doing a lot of lifting right there, though, because not a lot of people actually put any amount of thought into the idea.
Right, but the average layperson, they think, well, I chose chocolate ice cream, but I could have chosen vanilla.
I think the average layperson is basically right about that.
We'll have to have well, I mean,
We'll talk about it some other day.
I mean, I don't know if there's a short way to finish that, but I think in that case, the could have means different things to different people.
Yes, like if you rewound the universe to exactly where it was before they made the choice, they would always make the exact same choice. But I don't think that's what free will means in any meaningful way.
Yeah, it sounds like you're kind of in the vague realm of the Dan Dennett kind of version of, there's elbow room for decision making and stuff, and I see where he's coming from, and I think that he's just talking past people who are disagreeing with him.
I think talking past each other is the majority of thing that the majority of what happens in those debates.
Agreed. In fact, if you want to watch a good example of it in real life, or rather in audio slash text, he and Sam Harris had a nice back and forth several years ago.
I remember.
Yeah, and it culminated.
That went nowhere.
Well, it disappointingly went nowhere, but it went nowhere in a nice way, because they were friends and they got along well. But Sam Harris wrote a book called Free Will, which he says this is, he gave the hard stance of free will is not a thing. Even if you look inside yourself, it's not a thing. Which I liked. That was his, maybe not original to the world, but original to me contribution.
Okay.
That even if you look inside yourself as to where your decisions come from, they're not coming from anywhere that you have any control over. So like that it's one step further than just saying determinism is true. And then Dennett wrote a response in some publication that said, this is a great book because it illustrates how bad these arguments are. And Harris was like, man, fuck you, dude. I thought we were homies. And right. there was some spat back and forth. But they again, there was a podcast episode, I think they recorded in a bar on Sam Harris's Waking Up podcast. And if not there, I believe it's also on his website.
I mean, a perfect example of people saying that some things don't exist because of breakdowns between computational levels and what we mean with words. Eliezer ends this post with, your inability to imagine something is just a computational fact about what your brain can or can't imagine. Another brain might work differently, which is probably where Sam Harris's and Daniel Dennett's differences actually came through.
Could be. I think it's partly maybe that Dan is more of a professional philosopher. I need to get used to using past tense, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And Harris is philosophically trained, but isn't a professional philosopher. So I think he's able to just say, no, man, this is... He's kind of able to take a Yudkowskian stance against philosophy overall. Mm-hmm. Whereas I don't think Dennett would be so inclined, which is fun because Dennett clearly had a huge influence on Yudkowsky.
Yes, absolutely.
Anyway, moving on to angry atoms.
All right. When we're told about atoms, we visualize little billiard balls bumping into each other. This makes it seem obvious that atoms can push on things, too, by bumping into them. This is the beginning of the post, and he does give some caveats as to, like, yes, this is greatly simplified. This is not how it actually works, but, this is how we think of it, and in a simplified version, it's good enough.
Yeah, it's close enough for real life.
Yes.
For day-to-day life. But, Eneasz, what if I'm angry? I'm pissed right now, actually.
Oh, damn it.
Explain that in terms of atoms.
Yeah, how can little billiard balls be angry? Are there tiny frowny faces on the billiard balls? How can you explain angry behavior in terms of billiard balls? And I think this is exactly what happens when people who are trying to take naturalistic reductionist views to the world try to explain themselves, try to explain consciousness and free will and things like that. They think, well, everything is just little billiard balls bouncing around. How the fuck can they be angry? Eliezer points out clearly reductionism is just a flawed notion. Obviously, we know the punchline that reductionism is actually true, and yet we still get angry, so what the fuck? He says, the novice goes astray and says, the art failed me. The master goes astray and says, I failed my art.
I love that quote, the art failed me versus I failed my art. But the danger there is that you've got to make sure you've got the right art.
Yes. Yeah, you got to actually first be sure that your art is in fact correct and not like one of those martial arts where you never touch somebody and they fall over.
Oh, yes, the bullshido.
Is that what no. All right, for just a second, I thought that might be the name until the pun hit me.
That's not what they call it, but that's what I've heard it called.
Cool.
Yeah, so it's not just the idea of like neurons that process information. If you say this and nothing more, it just inserts a magical, unexplained level crossing rule into your model where you go from billiard balls to thoughts, and it's analogous to the appendigital bridging laws, right?
Yeah.
And you can't just say, well, the password is neurons and information processing. You don't get new knowledge from that. You're not any smarter for knowing those magic words.
Exactly. He does go ahead and say, all right, I'm going to give you a tremendously oversimplified explanation that should at least reduce the apparent length of the gap. If you have chains of causality inside the mind that have a kind of mapping, a mirror, an echo, to what goes on in the environment, then you can run a utility function over the end products of imagination and find an action that achieves something which the utility function rates highly and output that action. That was a lot of words, actually, which are nice to read, but I'm not sure they make great sense if they're said out loud in a podcast.
Yeah, you're right. I don't actually find it. I don't know exactly what he's getting at there. I would talk about anger in terms of underlying biology, but actually, I still don't. I read this and I didn't have a good reductionist explanation for anger. So,
like, the underlying biology came about because what happens inside our brains is affected by the environment, and our brains can affect the environment in turn. And over long enough periods of evolution, certain triggers happen that tend to get those things to reproduce when they act in these ways, when things are a certain way in the environment.
Yeah. I mean, and some of it is because it's socially beneficial and some of it's because it's personally beneficial. You know, like we have a very natural impulse towards anger when we see great injustice.
Yeah.
And part of that might be, you know, in a Hansonian lens of just us signaling how much we care about justice. But the other part of it is like, no, I'm actually really mad. This person, quote unquote, didn't deserve that, you know, and that fairness is built really hard into our brains. You know, we're social animals.
Yeah.
It's easy to imagine that like non-social animals maybe don't have anger.
I think that may be true. It's entirely possible that snakes don't have anything like anger.
Yeah. They just have leave me the fuck alone vibes.
Yeah, right. Turned out that people who have those angry emotions, angry reactions, out-reproduce people who don't. And I guess people in this case is not the correct term. Social entities, social animals. Eliezer says, even if you knew all the facts of neurology, you would not be able to visualize the level crossing between neurons and anger. Not the way you can visualize a hand consisting of fingers, thumb, and a palm. I think that's why it was good to have that intuition pump first. Like, remember how you could cross that one simple level before? Well, this is like that, but much, much bigger, and we're going to have to do a lot more work to cross that if we want to do it. But it's essentially the same thing, so prepare yourself. Gird your loins.
It's true that the hand-finger comparison is much easier for me to grasp. Explaining anger in terms of, in reductionist terms, is a bigger challenge.
Yeah. He says even, you know, the ultimate password is hormones. So you can say anger is hormones, but even if you repeat back the words, it doesn't mean you've crossed the gap, which leads to problems. Like, people come up with interpretations like anger is mere hormones. It's caused by little molecules. So it must not be justified in any moral sense. That's why you should learn to control your anger. Or possibly even, there isn't really any such thing as anger. I've heard both those things actually in the real world, and they're both wrong, because like saying anger is merely hormones is a lot like saying a rainbow is merely the refraction of light through water droplets. Like, sure, it's true, but the things that you think that implies is not what it actually implies.
Yeah, I agree. I was trying to get ChatGPT to actually give me a good explanation here. It's not saying anything that we didn't say, but it did put one thing nicely, just as far as saying, here's the higher level view of what anger is, here's the lower level view of what anger is. And I think that's the important distinction. You know, we've got a hand and then we've got fingers.
Yeah.
So like the higher level view is anger is the emotional state experienced as a response to perceived threats or frustrations, like we talked about, right?
Hmm.
The lower level components are the neural mechanisms, neurotransmitters, hormonal responses, etc. All of those things work together to make what we identify and call anger.
I get the feeling ChatGPT is not doing a good enough job bridging that inferential distance, and we would need somebody who's like a really good writer explainer like Eliezer to do all that work for us.
Or I could try longer than 5 seconds, but because I mean the answer anger is hormones. Even if I repeat the words back, doesn't mean I've crossed the gap, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like you said, anger is mere hormones. Well, come on, that's the red flag word right there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that was basically the entirety of those two posts. They are setting up a lot, I feel, more than making conclusions, because that's the whole point of these sequence posts, to make very long series of posts into a single coherent argument to bridge an inferential gap, and we are near the beginning of this particular bridge. Spoiler, we're coming up fast on the zombies sequence, which is a classic. Everybody loves it. It argues that consciousness is actually physically real, and later on also argues that free will is physical, real thing as well. So I'm looking forward to getting to those.
Yeah, it'll be fun. I feel like I've seen somewhere where somebody, like an actual philosopher, argued to Kowski about zombieism, and I'll have to find out. Oh, I know. I remember where it was. When we get there, I'll link to it. It was fun and frustrating.
And
He had a Blogging Heads TV debate with Massimo Piccolucci.
oh, okay. I
Yeah,
remember that dude.
yeah, he was chill. Actually, super chill. He's a stoic.
Ah, the guys who invented chill, basically.
Yeah, exactly. They talk past each other, and even at the last, I remember like the last few sentences, there was just no charity coming from Massimo there, and I'm not sure why. And there was so much talking past each other. If you guys want a frustrating 45 minutes, I'll link to it.
I can kind of see not having a great deal of charity to someone that you don't know, like who they are, what their deal is. You don't have a degree. Why should I take you seriously? Like if you meet them out in the wild, but like if you have agreed to go on to a debate with somebody, at that point, you, I feel, are required to give them charity because you agreed to this interaction.
Agreed. No idea why they got along so poorly there.
Maybe they had an argument earlier. Maybe Eliezer accidentally ran over his dog with his car or something.
I think it's that Eliezer shits on philosophers so much, and Massimo's a professional philosopher.
You know, that's not that's not wrong. That's a fair point. I might be similarly irked by someone who shat on the thing I love to do as much as Eliezer does.
Yeah, I think that there's a level of fairness to Yukowski's arguing against his railing against philosophy, but I think it might come off as overly dismissive of the entire enterprise of the last thousands of years. Maybe it's actually not unintentional. So,
Yeah.
anyway, what are we doing next time, Inyash?
Next time, we are reading the posts Heat versus Motion and Brain Breakthrough. It's made of neurons.
Oh boy, well, should be fun.
It should be a great time indeed.